Ancient lost artifacts, mythical, legendary weapons, armor, jewelry, stuff of tales and legends, and one or two somewhat well-known, well-proven artifacts that simply got lost to time and whose whereabouts are currently unknown. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is marshmallow and fennel tea, and join me as we explore part 2, of the legendary artifacts Iceberg. In tier 1, we have the highly requested, it seems, Durandal. But this was a very interesting weapon, which was a sword of a man named Roland, and he was a legendary paladin from 8th century France. And Roland fought for and under Charlemagne, this man right here, but Durandal the sword was said to be incredibly hard, incredibly durable, sharp, and in some accounts actually was on fire. Now, the meaning and origin of the name Durandal isn't entirely understood. There are some theories saying that it derives from the word durable and enduring. So, durable, enduring, Durandal. So that's one possibility. Another suggests that it comes from the words durant and then dale, or I guess this is flipped, so it would be durant Dale, but that would mean sharp scythe. So that's another possibility, that it was just a sharp cutting sword. Another possibility might be the old French kind of mistranslated ardent, which might mean something close to flame or flaming, hence the legends of this flaming sword. There's also the Arabic this word, which I am not gonna try and pronounce, but this would mean master of stone, on account of this sword, slicing through and destroying mountains and stones, which we will get into in just a little bit. But as you can see, a very, very cool legendary sword. Lots of, I think, possibilities for the origin of its name. And as for the origin of the sword itself, it has just as many, if not more, explanations. Some say that Charlemagne himself actually originally owned the sword, and then, gave it over to Roland. Some say the European legendary smith Wayland himself crafted it. Some say it was given down from the gods and then passed down through the generations. But all we do know for sure is that Roland owned the sword. He used it in many battles, in many fights, eventually using it in the Battle of Roncevaux, which I think is the one he's most known for. It's the most famous one. And in it, he basically saves the French army. He saves Charlemagne, but in the process gets himself surrounded, fatally wounded, and he ends up dying. But he didn't want the Saracen army to get Durandal, so according to the legend, he tried to actually destroy the sword by smashing it directly against marble. But obviously that didn't work. Like, hello, legendary sword here, what's a bit of marble gonna do? But here there are kind of different versions of the legend. Some say he just fell down and died and kind of hid the sword underneath him. Or my favorite account of what happened is that Roland couldn't destroy the sword, and the swipes from this sword actually cleaved the top of these mountains. In some accounts, it actually divides like a hole out of this mountain. And so, to help him hide the sword, he called upon Saint Michael. And Saint Michael came down, he gave Roland the strength to throw the sword, and he threw the sword several hundred kilometers in that direction, across the border into France, where it got embedded into the side of a mountain, and that is where Durandal came to rest. That was until it was apparently stolen by Henry the Young King in 1183. So the local people made a replica, they put it back into the rock, and then that was stolen, and then they made another replica and then shoved it into the rock. And basically the replicas just kept being stolen from this spot, with the last one stolen actually being in June of 2024, which I'll admit, it might be a pretty cool souvenir to keep, and I'm not condoning stealing. But we don't know where the original sword is. We don't really know where any of the replicas are, although the sword and the legend behind it, I think, are very cool. Tutankhamun's meteoric iron dagger. Is so freaking cool. It was this famous dagger made out of iron and owned by King Tut of Egypt in around the 1300s BC. But what makes this dagger really cool is the particular molecular makeup of it. That the iron found inside of this dagger is very similar to the iron found in meteorites. Because this iron dagger, while yes, mostly iron, is also comprised of about 11% nickel. And every other iron artifact that we found kind of in history that was maybe dug up from the ground, smelted into something, these never really exceed around 4%. Whereas meteoric iron, iron that's come directly from a meteor, that normally ranges between 5 and 35%. And as a reminder, this dagger sits at around 11%. So it very likely actually came from a meteor. And if that's not like the coolest thing that you could have owned at the time, and I don't know what is, like literal space dagger. And bear in mind, this was actually in the time of the Bronze Age. So they hadn't really even started mass producing iron, mass mining iron. They were still using bronze for most of their things, most of their smelting and weapons, etc. Iron at the time was actually more expensive than gold just because of how rare it was. And so they often would only really use iron for like royal gifts, little trinkets, little decorations sort of thing. And so just having an iron dagger on its own was already rare and expensive and awesome, let alone a meteoric iron dagger. Then, of course, the Bronze Age collapse happened, which check out my Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg videos if you want to learn a little bit more about that. It is truly a fascinating topic. But after the Bronze Age collapse, in came the Iron Age, in came mining iron, smelting it, and so iron daggers were less and less rare, less and less impressive. But this meteoric dagger, I think, will remain one of my favorite artifacts of all time. The Baghdad Battery refers to these 3 items found near Baghdad in 1938. And when these 3 items are combined together, they are thought to form a super early rudimentary battery. This was from the Parthian period, so around 200 BC. And these 3 items are a clay jar, which provides sort of the housing for the battery, a copper cylinder that sits inside of the jar, and an iron rod that goes inside the cylinder. And when this jar was filled with a electrolyte sort of liquid, so think lemon juice, vinegar, that sort of thing, it's possible that this was actually capable of producing a small electrical charge. Now, what exactly that charge might have been used for, we're not entirely sure. There are some people that theorize that this is evidence, this is proof of like these ancient, super advanced civilizations that ran their entire underground cities on these batteries, or maybe on more advanced batteries. They used to have iPhones 5,000 years ago. But I think a more likely theory is that 1, they were either just kind of experimenting, they were messing around with these things, or 2, they used it for something called electroplating, which is a process by which you can use a battery to basically transfer small layers of one metal onto another metal. And it's a very cool process all in all, honestly. You can use this to increase the durability of a certain metal, or to increase the resistances of it. Perhaps one metal is harder than another, perhaps one resists rust better than another, or just as a form of decoration to kind of change the look and feel of whatever metal you want. It's a very cool process. Look into it a little bit if you want to be impressed. And the Baghdad Battery, I think, is a very cool artifact. As I said, we're not entirely sure what it was actually used for, but hopefully someday soon we can actually find some more of these. The Rosetta Stone is somewhat of a well-known artifact, I would say, but it's still to this day absolutely amazes me every time I read about it. And it was found in 1799 in Egypt during a campaign run by Napoleon Bonaparte. And when it was found, it was an absolutely groundbreaking discovery because on this stone are 3 direct translations of the same text, same message, but in 3 different languages. It was a decree written by a council of priests, affirming the 13-year-old king Ptolemy V in 196 BC. And you had this same decree written in ancient Egyptian, so, in hieroglyphs, and in ancient Greek, and in something called demotic. Now, the hieroglyphs weren't used in kind of day-to-day work. No, they were used more in like official ceremonies or for engraving, kind of maybe like how we use Latin today. Demotic was basically what the modern in those days Egyptians used. So day-to-day they would speak in demotic, they would write their messages in it. Then there was ancient Greek, obviously the official language of ancient Greece at the time, but also of the Egyptian administration, because, of the influence of Greece, of the Ptolemy line of rulers originally coming from Greece. So all of these things combined kind of explained why there were 3 different versions of this. And as you can imagine, when this stone was first discovered, we knew a good chunk of ancient Greek, we knew a little bit less demotic, and we knew even less in ancient hieroglyphs. So this was like Google Translate in the ancient times, gave us a bunch of knowledge about what certain words and letters and orderings meant, etc. And this one discovery has helped us still to this day in figuring out the translations of these ancient languages. The Dead Sea Scrolls. So these were found between 1946 and 1956 in and around the Dead Sea, hence the name. But these were these ancient Jewish manuscripts and scrolls that had seemingly been written out, scrolled up into these clay jars, and hidden deep in these caves all around the area. And in these scrolls, we find some of the oldest surviving fragments of, for example, the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh and the Old Testament, as well as various other religious texts linking to early Christianity. And honestly, if this sounds interesting to you, I would highly recommend checking out a documentary on it, or just reading a bit further into the actual texts found here, as there are just far too many to go over in this short video. But they include, for example, the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is the longest, best preserved, oldest Old Testament script ever found, containing the entire book of Isaiah. There's a scroll detailing the rules and laws of a Jewish community at the time, the Qumran community. They were a sect of Jews who lived kind of on the outskirts of the Dead Sea, and so you have their local rules and customs, etc. This kind of gave us more evidence as to what they liked about the other Jews, what they disliked about them, how they saw Judaism was at the time. And this was all from around 150 BC all the way up to around 50 AD. So around 200 years, but it also spans over kind of early Christianity at the time. So if you want to take a read of it, I will leave a English translation down below, or a link to the English translation. But before these scrolls were found, the earliest version of the Old Testament that we had was actually a Greek translation. And this Greek translation had actually been translated itself based on an earlier Hebrew or Aramaic Old Testament, and then this one got lost. The Greek one was all that we had, and then that was translated either into English or to Hebrew or to whatever. And so another thing was that when these scrolls were found, they actually revealed that a bunch of the Greek translations were kind of inaccurate. They didn't do a terrible job. There were kind of 1 or 2 words that were kind of flipped here or there, like the word virgin, for example, originally just being young woman, the sons of Israel being just originally the sons of God in the Dead Sea Scrolls version, as well as many other differences. And if that wasn't enough, we still haven't gone through all of these scrolls that we've discovered. Because as you can imagine, these are very old scrolls. They're rolled up in these jars or pots or whatever. And so just the act of opening the jar in some cases could destroy the scrolls, but especially, taking them out, unfurling them. And so a bunch of them have been kept for, the last 100 years. And only now we're just starting to develop technology that can basically read the content of these scrolls from outside the jar without having even to unfurl them, which is just fascinating, and I am very excited to see what else might be on these scrolls. The Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch is, before anyone gives me hell in the comments, not a real artifact, but it's from one of my favorite films of all time. Film I'm sure you all know and love, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But this weapon is incredibly powerful. It comes with a set of instructions to use, and when it's first introduced, it is accompanied by the following text from the Book of Armaments, being, "And Saint Attila raised the grenade up on high, saying, O Lord, bless this thy hand grenade, that with it thou mayest blow up thine enemies to tiny bits in thy mercy. And the people did feast upon the lambs, and sloths, and carp, and anchovies, and orangutans, and breakfast cereals, and fruit bats, and large chalupas," which is this thing, by the way. Then they skip a bit, the text goes on to read, "And the Lord spake, saying, First shalt thou take out the holy pin. Then shalt thou count to 3, no more, no less. 3 shall be the number thou shalt count to, and the number of the counting shall be 3. 4 shalt thou not count to, neither count thou 2, excepting that thou then proceed to 3. And 5 is right out. Once the number 3, being the third number, be reached, then lobbest thou thy holy hand grenade of Antioch towards thy foe, who, being naughty in my sight, shall snuff it."
Right. 1, 2, 5. Lisa, 3.
And this was all, of course, during the battle with the outstandingly deadly and vicious killer rabbit of Kerbenog, who was known to jump at least 8 feet in the air and rip out someone's jugular, even decapitating them before they even knew which side of Tuesday was up. So a very, very deadly critter and a very fun entry. Tier 2, Goliath's Sword. So in the famous battle with the underdog young Jewish shepherd David versus the huge legendary Philistine warrior Goliath, David beats Goliath in single combat armed with only a sling and a rock. But after he won the fight, David grabbed Goliath's sword and he beheaded Goliath. Then took Goliath's sword, dedicated it to God as like thanks for winning the battle, and then he donates the sword to a city of priests. These priests then give David back the sword a little later on when he needs a weapon, and after that we don't really know what happens to it. There are some very, very interesting, fascinating theories here involving the Tuatha De Danann and the Scythian people and ancient Irish mythology, which we will cover in a little bit more detail a little further down. But just know for now that the Tuatha De Danann were a group of people, foreigners, invaders, who were, according to legend, somewhat magical. They came from somewhere, we don't really know where. They invaded Ireland, and they weren't unique in this. They weren't the only people who did. Another group was, for example, the Firbolg, who were apparently from Greece, the Milesians from Spain, as well as many, many other people. But these Tuatha De Danann, according to some theories, were actually the Scythian people, a nomadic warrior tribe who came from this sort of region and were actually descendants of Israel. And so this long, convoluted theory says that David, who was an Israelite, kept the sword of Goliath, or Goliath's sword, and he kept it within his people. He kind of passed it down from person to person. Some of these people eventually went off and became the Scythians, and importantly, they took the sword with them. Then they migrated all over the place, as nomads tend to do. They ended up in Ireland, settling there, making their home there, and these Scythian people all are what spurred on the legend of the Tuatha De Danann. And with them, they brought not only the Sword of Goliath, but also many other legendary artifacts, few of which we will get into a little bit further down. The Wallace sword is this lovely, beautiful sword said to have belonged to William Wallace, who was the legendary knight who led the Scottish resistance against the English in the late 1200s. And William Wallace, after this revolt, was executed in 1305, and it is said at the time that a local governor actually received the sword. Then it kind of fell out of the records. There are accounts like 200 years later stating that King James IV of Scotland actually commissioned an armorer to repair this sword. You know, to touch it up a little bit, create a new hilt, create a scabbard and a belt for it. And then there's again nothing for like 3 centuries until a letter was found in 1825 stating that this sword was being sent to the Tower of London for repairs. And the sword is currently being stored and displayed in the National Wallace Monument in Stirling, Scotland. And we're honestly not entirely sure if this is the original sword. You know, the one that belonged to Wallace may very well be. It might have been changed out over the years. It might have been destroyed and replaced or stolen or what have you. But let me know your thoughts on this one down below. Prydwen was one of the many artifacts of King Arthur, and this was a shield decorated with the image of the Mother Mary. And according to legend, any sword or weapon or anything that struck this shield would just immediately shatter, which honestly, it sounds pretty helpful. But since it is a Arthurian legend, we're not too sure if this shield ever actually existed, or whether the legend was based on an actual shield, or some combination of the two. And if it did ever exist, we're not entirely sure where it is today. Akkad refers to this ancient city and capital of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. And the strange thing is, we know that this city existed, as it has been referenced many times. Its location has been hinted at, but we've never actually found the city or its exact location. As I said, we've taken kind of clues from various sources. Say, okay, this city was like near X river, and then another source would say that this city lay east of somewhere or west of another place. So we have kind of triangulated its position to somewhere in this sort of region, but there are some major problems with actually finding this city. The first problem, probably the major problem, is that a city this large and this old very likely would be buried quite deep. And so it might just be located underneath a very heavily built up area in somewhere like Baghdad, meaning you can't really go digging around, at least not very efficiently. And 2, a lot of the references to the location of the city are in reference to the Tigris River, and it is thought that the river itself has moved about over the years. So even if it were to the east of the river, 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, it's a very old city, it's likely the river has kind of morphed and changed over that time, and so the references are becoming just less and less useful. It is a fascinating topic. I do kind of have faith, if not hope, that the city will be found eventually, as God knows what we'll discover under there, but only time will tell. The sandals of Jesus were said to be, well, Jesus's sandals that were donated to the Prum Abbey by Pepin the Short. This was all the way back in the 750s, and they remain in this abbey to this day. They were said to have been a gift from Roman Pope Stephen II, and they were given to Pepin the Short, which he then donated them. But the lineage of these sandals before this, all the way back to apparently the life of Jesus, if they were in fact his sandals, is unfortunately a little unclear. The Sword of Islam. So after Italian dictator Mussolini occupied Libya, he declared himself the protector of Islam, and he was gifted what was called the Sword of Islam by a man named Yusuf Kerisk, who was a Berber leader in northern Africa, who obviously supported Mussolini's occupation of Libya. And this sword was pretty cool. It was a pretty good sword. Notably, parts of it were crafted from gold, which made it a very valuable sword. But when Mussolini fell from power, sword kind of disappeared. It's never turned up since. And so we don't know if it was stolen or lost or destroyed or melted down for lunch money or something. But that is the Sword of Islam. The Shield of Achilles. So back in ancient Greece, Homer, not that guy, but Homer was a poet, he was a writer, and he wrote two famous stories which you might have heard of, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And within them is the story of Achilles, who, as you all might know, was dipped into the river Styx, making him completely invulnerable. Except when his mum dipped him into this river. I guess she didn't want to get her hands wet, so she didn't dip all of him in. She just grabbed him by the ankle, dipped him in, so he was more or less completely invulnerable. But because his ankle didn't technically go in the river, that was his one weakness, or his Achilles heel. And of course, because of this, in the story, he was then shot through the ankle with an arrow, and he ended up succumbing and dying, which... Firstly, that is not a responsible way to dip a baby in a river. I mean, not that you should be, dipping many babies in rivers. But if you are gonna dip a baby in a river, probably don't do it by just grabbing the end of one ankle. But Achilles was a legendary warrior in these stories, and so he naturally had many legendary artifacts. And one of those artifacts was his shield. And this shield is really quite beautiful. It is described in the Iliad, and it depicts on the shield these murals almost of the earth, the sun, the sky, the sea, the moon and stars and people and buildings, cities, houses, just all sorts. But where this shield is or whether it ever existed, we don't currently know. The Irish crown jewels. So these are these gorgeous, voluptuous pieces of jewelry that were created in 1831 for the Grand Master of the Irish Knights Order of St. Patrick in Ireland, and they were kept in Dublin Castle until 1907, when they were stolen and haven't been seen since. And these black and white photos don't really do the jewels justice. They were crafted with green emeralds forming this shamrock shape. They had red rubies in. Their motto was like engraved with pink diamonds. Then they also had regular diamonds thrown in there, and all in all, each piece of jewelry was worth, in today's money, just over around maybe £2 million, $2.5 million US, or $5 million for the pair of them. And the whole case surrounding these jewels and surrounding the theft is just absolutely wild. As I said, these jewels were kept in the Dublin Castle, and they were kept under the protection of the Ulster King of Arms, Sir Arthur Vickers, who was known apparently to get very drunk and was even said to have woken up one day after a night of drinking, a night of lollygagging all over the place, and woke up with the jewels around his neck and no memory of how they even got there. And so, after these jewels went missing, a few people naturally blamed Arthur. Arthur blamed his second-in-command, Frank Shackleton, and the commission investigating this eventually found no one guilty of the theft, but did find Arthur guilty of, misconduct, of not exercising proper vigilance in protecting these jewels, as he was the protector and watcher of them after all. And interestingly enough, Frank Shackleton was actually the brother of a man named Ernest Shackleton, who was the famous explorer and survivor of the Antarctic, and we will be covering his story in an upcoming video. But this investigation basically went back and forth. Arthur blaming Frank, saying he set him up, he got him drunk, and this didn't really go anywhere. And one of the reasons why perhaps it didn't go anywhere was there was a deeper political subplot surrounding this whole theft, surrounding the Dublin castle, as it was thought that Frank was involved in and had information and knowledge about what were called at the time the Dublin Castle homosexual scandals of 1884, which, as you can imagine, was more taboo in those sorts of days, and involved, sex parties within the castle. It involved bringing prostitutes in regularly, and it was very likely the case that because Frank knew about all of this, he knew the names of perhaps some high-up officials, maybe he had threatened to kind of spill the beans if anyone prosecuted him. It is thought that that was a major reason why he was never convicted, or at least why he was never investigated, because there wasn't any solid evidence linking Frank to this case, or to this theft. But even though there were investigations still going on, somewhat passively, this case has never been solved, and these fantastic, beautiful Irish jewels were never found. The Piri Reis map is a 1513 world map created by Ottoman explorer and admiral Piri Reis. And it's really a wonderful little map, at least what we have left of it, as what you see on screen is basically all we have. There's roughly 2/3 of the world missing from this map, which were, as far as we can tell, just lost to time. It was gifted in 1517 to the Ottoman Sultan by Piri Reis himself, and then we don't really know what happened to it until it was rediscovered in 1929. And it really is one of the more fascinating maps from the 16th century. And there are more accurate world maps from around this time, but I think the uniqueness behind the Piri Reis map is what makes it so fascinating. For one, the sources that Piri used for his map were unusually diverse, especially for the Muslim world at the time, because it was slightly, a faux pas. It was like slightly taboo for, if you were in the Islamic world, to use Western sources for stuff like this, because it was kind of understood that the Muslim world is superior. We have better scientists, better explorers, better map makers, so they would typically keep a lot of their sources within the Muslim world. But Piri Reis used Portuguese maps. He used an Arabic map of India. He likely also used an early version of a Christopher Columbus map to help with the mapping of South America. And it is thought he likely got this Christopher Columbus map from a navy battle he fought in the 1500s, and after winning that battle, he captured a particular Spaniard, and this Spaniard had apparently been on Christopher Columbus's voyage, and with him, he very likely had one of his maps. But as well as those, he used many charts, many smaller maps, many ideas and references, etc. And on top of that, Piri Reis's map kind of goes against the generally accepted Islamic idea that was often seen on world maps or maps at the time, being the world ocean or world river, which was this giant body of water that basically encircled the earth. So this Piri Reis map was like a beautiful melding sort of the Islamic world and all of its knowledge, also of the Western world, European ideas and maps. And yes, there are some things that he got wrong on this map. There are some land masses and islands that he missed. There are some ones that he put in which don't actually exist. But that is all absolutely to be expected with a world map from this sort of age, which, bear in mind, this was in the age of exploration. They didn't have Google Maps set up yet. Christopher Columbus had just only recently made his way over to South America. North America wouldn't be settled by Europeans for another 50 years. And Australia and the Atlantic wouldn't be discovered for another 250 years. I'll leave this translated version up if you want to pause the video and read it. I'll also leave a link down below if you want to check it out and give it a little read. But it was a super, super fascinating artifact. Almung is the sword that legendary warrior and hero Sigurd used to kill Fafnir, who was a great dragon or worm in Germanic folklore. And it's a pretty cool sword. Sigurd's carrying it here, as you can see, looking like a fish for some reason. Fish with arms and legs. And all of Sigurd's weapons, this one included, was said to glow bright and gold and may or may not have had a dragon emblazoned on it. And according to legend, Sigurd received this sword when his father Sigmund, during his sister's wedding feast, witnessed a strange man walk in, grab his sword, and jam it into a nearby tree. And he declared, whoever shall pull this sword from this tree shall be the rightful owner and wielder, and shall be allowed to keep it. But what they didn't know at the time was that this strange old man was actually Odin himself. And everyone came up, they tried to pull the sword out of the tree. Everyone failed except Sigmund. And he grabbed the sword, pulled it out, and so was allowed to keep it. So eventually after this, the king of the area, he gets jealous of Sigmund. He kills Sigmund's father, he captures his family, and then Sigmund takes this sword and basically goes John Wick on the king, you know, hunting him down, using the sword, killing people, until eventually Odin himself breaks the sword in two. Then, fast forward years later, Sigmund's son Sigurd is training as a blacksmith, and he learns of the great dragon Fafnir that he then decides to slay. But to slay this dragon, he kind of needs a sword, and it may as well be legendary if you're going to fight a great dragon. So after many attempts at, you know, blacksmithing his own legendary sword, in the end he just decides to forge together these two broken halves, and Balmung, his father's legendary weapon, is whole once again. It's sharp, it's beautiful, it's legendary, and Sigurd does in the end up slaying Fafnir with it. Muramasa was a legendary Japanese blacksmith who was responsible for making some pretty gnarly weapons, daggers, samurai swords, katanas that were impressively unique, high quality, good level of craftsmanship. And he also founded the school of Muramasa. And the school itself spanned for like 3 generations, and some of Muramasa's students from the school actually went on to create legendary weapons of their own. Like, for example, the Tonbikiri, one of the 3 great spears of Japan, and the Inoshishigiri, or the Boar Slayer. And although we don't know too much about Muramasa as an individual, it is rumored that he might have been a student of Masamune, who himself was said to be the greatest swordsmith in all of Japanese history. Tier 3 Vitrum Flexile, or flexible glass, and this was apparently invented in ancient Rome during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. According to the account, the inventor came up to Tiberius himself, and he brought him a glass drinking bowl and challenged Tiberius to get the glass bowl and smash it. But after a solid attempt, this glass bowl simply, bent a little bit, dented, didn't shatter, and then this man went up to it with a small hammer and knocked it back into shape, and apparently it seemed as good as new. He swore that he was the only sole inventor of this glass, that he alone in the entire world had knowledge of the recipe. And then immediately after this, Tiberius had this man beheaded, meaning this incredible technology was basically lost forever, at least as far as the legend goes. People say that Tiberius might have done this for various reasons, maybe to protect the interests of, big glass. So all the people that were making money out of glass manufacturing, he didn't want to put them out of business with this new technology, this new invention. Or because he thought this material might have been so valuable that it would have debased his own currencies, would have debased gold and silver, etc. And he didn't want that, so he just killed the man. Was this perhaps alien technology, or an early discovery of something like plastic, or was it genuinely, truly flexible glass? Let me know your thoughts on this down below. And just a quick reminder, folks, that good things come to those who subscribe. I am very close to hitting my goal of 50,000 subscribers, and if this video gets more than 2 likes, I will release the part 3 finale. Kusanagi no Tsurugi is a legendary royal sword of Japan that is said to have been obtained from the tail of Yamata no Orochi, who was the legendary 8-headed or 8-tailed serpent. And apparently, according to this legend, this serpent or dragon had consumed 7 of this man's 8 daughters, and the dragon was coming for his 8th daughter. So the god Susanoo came and promised to kill this dragon, essentially to protect this man's family, only if this man gave his final daughter to this god, so they could get married. And so the father thought this was a good idea. He agreed to this deal. The god Susanoo then took this daughter, transformed her into a comb so that he could wear the comb in his hair, and she could be with him while he was battling this dragon. Which, okay. But he did go and fight this dragon. He ended up slaying the dragon and chopping off each of the dragon's heads, and then chopping off each of its tails. And it was inside the dragon's 4th tail that Susanoo apparently discovered this great weapon, the Kusanagi no Tsurugi. It was then passed down through the generations until the great warrior Yamato Tamago got his hands on it. And this legendary warrior later on got kind of lured into this trap. This warlord lured Yamato into this field. He killed Yamato's horse and then set the entire field surrounding Yamato on fire. But just as there was no hope left, Yamato ended up using this legendary sword to basically cut all of the grass around him, stopping the fire and saving his life. But Yamato also discovered a kind of special ability, special power of this sword, was that it could control wind. And so while these flames were all around him, he cut the grass, saved himself, but also used it to shoot the wind back at this warlord, and with the wind came the flame, and that spelled the end of this warlord. And so after this legendary battle, sword was named Kusanagi no Tsurugi, or the grass cutting sword. As before this, the sword was named Amemo Morokumo no Tsurugi, or the heavenly sword of gathering clouds. It has apparently been kept in the Atsuta shrine since the 12th century, but it has not been publicly displayed there. They won't, reveal it or show it to anyone, as it is apparently so precious, so rare and holy and divine. And so we don't know for sure that it is still kept there, but that is the official status of it, at least for now. The Book of Thoth is honestly a very interesting entry. So the Egyptian god Thoth was similar in many ways to the Greek god Hermes. Now, they both invented writing. They were both gods of similar things: knowledge, messages, wisdom. Thoth was also the god of magic and the moon for some reason, which, yeah, we'll throw that in as well. But the ancient Book of Thoth was said to contain, and I quote, all knowledge of laws, magic, nature, and the afterlife, and contained 2 spells, one of which allowed the person to understand animal languages, which is pretty useful, and another one which allowed them to perceive the gods themselves, which, yeah, that's also pretty useful. And the legend goes that Thoth wrote this book himself, and it was hidden at the bottom of the Nile, locked inside a series of boxes guarded by snakes, which is like ancient high security, I guess. An Egyptian prince then discovered these books. He fought off the snakes. He secured this knowledge for himself. But as punishment for stealing this Book of Thoth, both his wife and his son were killed. He then died as well a little later on and was buried with this book. Years later, another person tries to, take this book from the guy's tomb, and he is then met with terrible misfortunes and trickery and illusions. So eventually this new man then takes the book and returns it, with the moral of the story kind of being that, like, this knowledge is only meant for the gods. It's perhaps something similar to the, Adam and Eve story. And the term Book of Thoth is also discussed in like a wider meaning, because generally the done thing at the time was that because Thoth was like the god of knowledge, god of wisdom, the god of writing, a lot of the manuscripts and texts and books, etc., that were written by, priests or scribes or pretty much anyone were attributed to Thoth. So in their eyes, because Thoth was like the originator of knowledge and wisdom, he basically got credit for anything they wrote down. And so a lot of these books, these manuscripts, these texts, which were written by humans, by scribes or priests or what have you, they were like penned as being written by Thoth. And so you often have anything written by Thoth being included in the Book of Thoth. And hopefully that wasn't too confusing. The seven-branched sword. Is this gnarly looking cactus sort of sword?
In 18 BC, Baekje was founded in a
That was apparently a gift from the king of Baekje, which was an old Korean kingdom, to a Yamamoto ruler, which Yamamoto being an area in old Japan. And this was all in roughly the 3rd century. And the seven-branched sword has some inscriptions on the sword. This on one side, this on another. And what's that? You don't speak Chinese? Oh, alright. So these are the English translations of these inscriptions, and you may want to pause to read them, but they basically list when the sword was made and how cool and high quality and amazing the sword is. And it has been kept since apparently forever in the Isonokami Shrine in Japan. It's not currently on public display, but it is very likely still there. And yeah, very cool, unique looking sword. The Guy Bulka spear of Cuchulainn was a legendary spear in Old Irish, meaning belly spear, or meaning spear of mortal death, which is a fantastic name for a weapon. But this was the spear of Cuchulainn, who was a great Irish warrior and demigod in Irish mythology. And honestly, the mythology and stories and tales behind this are absolutely fantastic. It was apparently made from the bones of a legendary sea monster, and this sea monster died while fighting another legendary sea monster. And when this spear was used, it would fly into, whoever you threw it at. It would go into their bodies, and then it would open up into 30 barbed mini spears, basically completely lodging it wherever you threw it, or into whoever you threw it. Or is it whomever? But it was said that the only way then to remove this spear was to cut it out of the unfortunate victim, basically ensuring that you killed them in the process. Yeesh. Or quiche. Some versions of the legend say that there were 7 spears that came out. So, you threw the original spear, it opened up into 7 mini spears, and then each of those mini spears opened up itself into 7 mini spears. So you just have a lot of spears within this weapon. Nerja's universal ring is a ring in Chinese mythology, also known as the Qiankun ring. And this was used by Nerja, who was a legendary figure. He was a protector of Buddhism, of Taoism, of general folklore, and he is often depicted in his teenager or childlike form. The ring was gifted to him by his powerful mentor. It was made of gold. It could grow or shrink depending on, its will. And it was completely indestructible and very often killed whoever it was thrown at. People, deities, dragons, demons, basically anything and anyone. And in case you didn't think that was powerful enough, it could also suppress enemies, it could tie them up, neutralize them. It could also just kind of bonk into people and mountains and not necessarily slice through them or kill them, just make a giant smash, maybe an earthquake. And once again is on the growing list, I think, of just insanely overpowered legendary weapons. Marmiados is a legendary weapon from the Arthur tales, but was actually said to be more powerful and more brilliant than Excalibur. Marmiados was generally wielded by King Rion in Ireland, who was a giant, by the way. Just thought I'd throw that in there. But basically, King Arthur is fighting King Rion. King Rion gets his sword, Marmiados. He slams it down on King Arthur, and it hits into and gets lodged into Arthur's shield. Then, because it's lodged in there, Arthur is then able to, get around, kill King Rion, and he takes his sword, Marmiados, and actually starts using it himself, preferring to instead lend Excalibur to his nephew Sir Gawain, showing just how much better Marmiados was. Some say Marmiados was forged by the Roman god of fire, or that it was originally owned by Hercules and then passed down through the ages, but truth be told, no one's entirely sure of the origins of this mythical weapon. Clarent is another sword from the Arthurian tales, and as with a lot of these Arthurian artifacts, doesn't get talked about quite as often as Excalibur. But this Clarent sword was incredibly important, not necessarily for battles or for fighting, but for the various ceremonies. It was symbolic of the strength of the kingdom, of the peace and diplomacy that it had set up. But after Mordred, Arthur's nephew, stole this sword, he actually used it to kill Arthur in a fight, which is pretty ironic for a sword of peace and diplomacy. The sword with the red hilt, which is once again another Arthurian artifact, and this was a sword that was also tied in with misfortune, with curses and bad luck, etc. And according to the legend, the sword was brought to King Arthur's court, with it being declared that only the most exceptional knight would be able to remove this sword from its scabbard and wield it. And that knight ended up being Sir Balin. But as I said, later down the road, it leads to kind of curses, to misfortune, and this leads to Sir Balin and his brother accidentally killing each other in a fight, marking it, I think, forever as a very unfortunate sort of bad luck sword. Honjo Masamune. So we briefly touched on Masamune earlier. Now, the legendary greatest swordsmith in all of Japanese history. And the Honjo Masamune was a sword that he actually created. And it was named this later on after the general Honjo Shigenaga. And the sword itself was crafted obviously in Masamune's period, so like the 12 to 1300s, and was picked up by some means by this General Honjo, after whom the sword was appropriately named. Then it was passed down from warrior to warrior, shogun to shogun, until eventually it was declared a Japanese national treasure in 1939, and was then handed over to the United States after World War II, and then just completely disappeared. We have records of it being handed over, or, confiscated or taken or what have you because Japan lost World War II, but we don't have any records for where it went or what happened to it. Whether it was stolen, hidden, lost, destroyed, we simply don't know. Hopefully it does turn up one day, because I think it is a very cool Japanese artifact, but that is the Honjo Masamune. The Antikythera mechanism is a fantastic mechanism found at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea in a Greek shipwreck from around 100 BC or over 2,000 years ago, and it is widely considered to be the earliest found evidence of an analog computer. Now, when I say the word computer, it wasn't like modern day computers. It didn't have Skype and Sims and Minesweeper or Skyrim on, but it was a computer in that it computed. So it computed stuff like the moving of stars, the tracking of the sun and the moon, potentially the tracking of the planets, predicting of eclipses, and was likely used as some sort of, moving calendar, which is just insane for 100 BC. The ancient Greeks were truly phenomenal. You can imagine what this sort of device would have looked like, you know, brand new, in working condition, with little cranks and cogs and things turning around, tracking the movement of, you know, all the celestial bodies somewhat perfectly. And while there are a few theories about who might have made this or invented it, you know, from Archimedes to Hipparchus, to just crediting a bunch of the ancient Greek schools at the time, it's not likely we'll ever pinpoint an exact creator for it, but it is kept on display in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens if you're ever there and you want to pop in and check it out. The 9 tripod cauldrons. So these were these 9 cauldrons, not these ones, as these are just recreations of the originals. These 9 cauldrons were basically the symbol of the divine right to rule, and they were basically owned and kept by whoever was ruling China at any particular time. So first they were made and kept by the Xia dynasty, which we will touch on them in just a little bit. Then they got overthrown by the Shang dynasty. The cauldrons were passed down. Then the Zhou dynasty took over, and once again the cauldrons were passed down. But the legend goes that the founder and the leader of the Xia dynasty, named Yu the Great, legend goes that he divided China up into 9 provinces and took, among many other things, bronze tributes from each province. And with each of the bronze tributes that he received, he made a cauldron. And so with these 9 cauldrons, it kind of represented the unity of China. It represented his rule over all of the 9 provinces. And this legend is interesting because the Xia dynasty, now that was apparently ruled by Yu the Great, the Xia dynasty itself is kind of somewhat mythical. We don't actually have any physical records of the Xia dynasty, as the earliest writing from China we have is from the Shang dynasty, which was the one dynasty after the Xia dynasty. But how we came to know about the Xia dynasty was really from texts and speeches found from the Zhou dynasty, which was the one after the Shang dynasty. So you've got the Xia, the Shang, and then the Zhou. And there's text from the Zhou dynasty saying that we are justified in taking over power from the Shang dynasty, just as the Shang dynasty was justified in taking power from the Xia dynasty. But, as I said, we've never actually found anything physical from the Xia dynasty. There are some theories to suggest that the Xia dynasty might be kind of one and the same as something called the Erlitou culture, which was a group of people who lived around this sort of region who we do have physical evidence for, and they do share some similarities with what might be the Xia dynasty, but this connection, this link between the two isn't entirely proven. But after the Zhou dynasty was then taken over again by the Qin dynasty, which a lot of dynasties, I know. But after the Zhou dynasty fell, these cauldrons basically went missing. Don't know if they were destroyed or melted down, or the new dynasty didn't like these traditions from the old dynasties. But either way, those are the 9 legendary cauldrons. Leonardo's robot. Is this robot, machine, mechanical man created by Leonardo da Vinci in the 15th century? And it should be stated that this is just a recreation. We're not sure if Leonardo himself actually ever built something like this, but these schematics were found in the 1950s, like 400 years after Leonardo da Vinci wrote them, and we then followed the schematics and built out these prototypes of our own. As you can see, the design is basically done within a suit of armor. The idea was to use the suit of armor, you know, as like a frame. Then you have the mechanics inside, moving the arms, moving the legs, tilting the neck and head back and forth. And depending on how complex you want to get, could actually move the arms in, you know, all sorts of degrees, move the hands, the fingers, could grab things. And yeah, so a very cool artifact, a very cool invention and design by, once again, our main man, Leonardo da Vinci. Gungnir is a pretty basic one. It is just the Spear of Odin, basically, which is talked about probably less than Thor's Meow Meow. But this crazy powerful spear always hit its target whenever it was thrown. And this was regardless of the skill or the strength of the thrower. So you could literally have like a baby pick up this spear, or an ant, and then throw it at whoever the ant intended to hit. Probably another ant or a wasp. I don't really know who ants hate. Termites, maybe? But it would fly straight and true to that target, always hitting it every single time. The spear was created by dwarven blacksmith masters called the Sons of Ivaldi, and actually after this spear was made, Loki made a bet with some other dwarves, and basically said that there was no way that they could create something as glorious and amazing as the Sons of Ivaldi had created. And in arranging this little competition, this bet, out of it came the Boar of Freya, the Ring of Odin, and the Hammer of Thor, otherwise known as Meow Meow. Joyeuse was the sword used by Charlemagne in all the things he was up to in the 8th century. You know, defending and uniting Europe, being emperor, and such and so forth. But it's a pretty gnarly sword. It's pictured here with a later younger sheath or scabbard. And aside from being quite beautiful, it is, as with a lot of these legendary artifacts, kind of tinted in legend and myth, with it being said that the spear of Longinus, so the spear that was jabbed into Jesus's side, legend says that a piece of that spear was actually built into the hilt or handle of Joyeuse. Joyeuse, of course, being the French word for joy, which I'm not sure the people being stabbed with this sword would agree with that name, but it is currently on display in the Louvre in France, if you're ever around there and feel like, you know, popping in and taking a look. The Olmec Colossal Heads. So as far as stone monuments go, these are perhaps some of the least talked about. Now, everyone talks about Stonehenge and Easter Island, but who really knows about the Olmec Colossal Heads? I mean, I sure don't, or at least I didn't until I researched this entry. But these are these huge, fantastic carvings of stone, and the stone itself that was used to carve these were absolutely massive, huge pieces. They weigh several tons. They were moved in some cases more than 150 kilometers, you know, to get from where they originated over to where they are. And I mean, just walking that distance would take incredibly long. It's like 93 miles, probably like 50 hours of walking. So to move these huge boulders this distance is just insane. And these stones were all located in the Olmec area, so around kind of Mexico, Central America sort of region. And they all seem to have unique headwear or hats, or perhaps helmets, and each of the human individuals seems to also be unique. So it seems maybe somewhat likely that these carvings actually represented like Olmec leaders, maybe rulers, maybe generals of sorts, maybe kings, and their people honored them by carving them into stone. And just as a bonus fact, Olmec was actually one of the 6 cradles of civilization. And so as you can imagine, if like the people in South America start to develop a civilization, and then people in the Middle East develop a civilization, it's not like one civilization caused the other, or that they migrated to one another. They're like completely separate, entirely different civilizations. And so that's why we have these 6 what are called cradles of civilization, which were 6 entirely separate civilizations that popped up all around the world at a fairly early age. And Olmec in Central America was one of them. The others being Sumer in modern-day Iraq, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization around sort of India sort of area, the Erlitou culture, which might have been, as we discussed earlier, the Shah dynasty in around China, and some South American civilizations around the Andes Mountains. Tier 4, the Hope Diamond. So this was this big-ass diamond, 45.52 carats. It was a beautiful bluey sort of purpley color, which just looks fantastic. And it is currently kept in the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of National History, which is in Washington, D.C. in America. So that's finally one that my US viewers can realistically go over there and see. But let me know what state you live in down below. And as to why this diamond is so notable, well, obviously it's a huge diamond, it's blue, but it is also thought to be kind of a cursed diamond, or at least bring on some amount of bad luck. There was first records of it in like 1666, which firstly is very long ago, and secondly, if we're talking about bad luck, it was found in 1666, but this gem might be the work of the devil. I'm just saying. But at the time it was purchased from India, it was uncut, it still had imperfections in, and an Irishman named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, I'm only kidding, Jean-Baptiste was obviously a Frenchman, but he purchased the diamond, he had it cut down a little bit, he had it cleaned up, and that resulted in a gem that looked sort of like this. This was a recreation done based on early drawings of the gem, and he named it the Blue Diamond of France, or the French Blue, or Le Bleu de France. And honestly, I would have kept the gem just like this. To me, this looks absolutely gorgeous. But he then sold the gem to King Louis XIV. King Louis was then, as we all know, beheaded during the French Revolution, after which Le Bleu de France, as well as various other gems, jewelry, royal items of sorts, were all stolen during the Revolution, and this gem didn't turn up for another 20 years. And it is highly suspected that whoever stole it basically had it smuggled and transported to London, where it was then cut down even more and crafted into this necklace or pendant. This pendant was then sold on, and it eventually made its way into the possession of the Hope family, who were a rich banking family at the time. And ever since then, it has been named after them, being the Hope Diamond. Then passed on to a few more people before being donated to where it resides today, the Smithsonian Institution's National this place. And as it is currently on display, anyone is free to go in there, take a look. It's a very beautiful gem. But I think it really is quite a shame that it was cut down so much. It was, cleaned up in a way, which I guess that's the style, to make these nice edges to reflect light in different ways. But I think I do really like the clarity and the cleanliness and the simplicity of the original gem. But as for the curse of the blue diamond, there were some early reports saying that it was stolen from India. So this is where the curse originated. And there was a 1911 New York Times article that was posted saying that this gem was cursed, and basically listing a bunch of people who had owned the gem or had been in possession of it and had soon after kind of met their fate, dealt with misfortune, and this further encouraged the rumor of it being a cursed diamond. Sword Kladinets is a sword from old Russian folklore that in some cases is a very strong sword, in some a magical sword, and in some kind of a bit of both. It is also understood in some legends to be the very same sword as the mech sword or the self-swinging sword, which just sounds fantastic. Like imagine you just stick it out and it just swings automatically. You don't even need to move your hand. But as seems to be a kind of recurring theme with a lot of these legendary weapons, especially swords, it was often said that the sword Kladinet was hidden or wedged or stuck inside of a wall or a rock or a stone or a tree or a mountain, and whoever shall be worthy enough to pull it out would then be able to wield it. Pangu's axe is not this axe from Sims, for anyone who plays Sims. Shout out to Chickpea. But Pangu was in Chinese mythology a great primordial being, a god or godlike individual from the Chinese or Taoist creation story. And Pangu, he was himself outside of creation, and he had a giant axe which he used to cleave the creation egg, often called the cosmic egg. And with this one cut, he separated heaven from earth, or the sky from earth. He separated yin from yang, and he himself stood there between the two worlds, basically holding up the sky so that it didn't fall down on earth. And he stayed there for 18,000 years. And then eventually Pangu died, and all the parts of his body and being transformed into different parts of the universe. So this was both his physical body, his head, his arms, his legs, but also his breath, his voice, his eyes, and even his fleas. Literally, the fleas that were on him transformed into bits of the universe. Very cool. So this legend is nothing if not unique. Ireland's Leah Fall is a big rock, and it's a standing stone made of granite located in Ireland, in County Meath if you want to be particular. But it is thought to have been used as the crowning site for many, many kings of Old Ireland. So very cool. It was thought to have been brought here by the Tuatha De Danann, the magical, somewhat mythical divine race of people who we discussed earlier as potentially being the Scythian tribe, who brought Goliath's sword over to Ireland. But it is said that, according to legend, this stone roars or cries out either in the presence of a true king of Ireland or in the presence of a false king of Ireland who is trying to usurp the throne and take power for himself. So it's not entirely useful. It's a bit like having a black marker that turns red whenever you write something that is true, but also whenever you write something that is false. And I think this stone just roared a lot. Very indiscriminate with its roars. But the stone still remains here in Ireland to this day, despite being vandalized many, many times for whatever reason. I don't know why you'd vandalize a rock, but okay. But that is the Leah Fall. The Skofnung is an awesome sword that belonged to the legendary Danish king, Hrolf Kraki, which the pronunciation is still up for debate on that one. But according to legends, this is said to be the greatest, best sword that was ever carried in the northern lands, which is one hell of a claim. It was known for its sharpness, for its durability, its strength, as well as being imbued with the spirits of the 12 faithful berserker bodyguards of the king, which is one hell of an enchantment. Imbuing it with 12 berserker guards in one sword. Once again, talk about overpowered. But the sword, according to these sagas, these stories, gets passed down from person to person, and it has a few other kind of quirks or interesting details about it, like it not being able to be drawn in the presence of women, and if it is drawn, it needs to taste blood before it is resheathed, which is an interesting trait. And any wound created by Skofnung cannot ever be healed unless it is rubbed with this particular rock or stone, which was a special stone given alongside the sword, named the Skofnunga stone. Sampo is another artifact from Nordic mythology, this time from Finland, and it was kind of a magical device. There are various descriptions of what this Sampo actually was, from it being a compass to an astrolabe to a chest with a rare artifact inside of it, or a coin, a piece of cloth, a piece of armor. And this isn't at all an exhaustive list of all the items that it could be, as there are many, many theories regarding it. But the Sampo was said to endow the holder with riches, with food, with water, with fine wines, with little knickknacks. It was made by the legendary blacksmith Ilmarinen. Ilmarinen then got a ton of bad luck, misfortune, his life was in shambles, so he went on a mission or quest to retrieve his creation, and in one of these battles it was destroyed and sadly lost at sea. The Buddha's Tooth. So we covered this type of artifact in the last Iceberg, I believe. I think it was under Buddha relics or something. But this tooth of the Buddha is one of these Buddha relics. What happened was, according to legend, the Buddha, or Gautama, died, and his belongings as well as himself, so his body, but also his cups, his mugs, his stick, all of that stuff was burnt down, and the ashes and then various body parts were basically spread throughout all of Asia, and they would serve as blessings for various shrines and temples. And in this instance, his teeth were spread out, and in particular his 4 canine teeth. And they are all currently being kept in 4 different temples around Asia, giving the blessing of Buddha to whoever goes there and worships. Hrunting and Naegling were these two epic swords given to Beowulf in the epic poem Beowulf, written in the 8th to 11th century in England, and is actually the oldest surviving English poem or written adventure that we currently have. It was, as I said, written in England in English, but it was set 400 to 500 years before this in Scandinavia, which wouldn't have been too unusual. Now, what with all the Scandinavians and Angles and Saxons going over to England, which is obviously where we actually get the name England from, after the Angles took over. Angleland, England, England. So it might make sense that after the migration and/or invasion of these Nordic people, that perhaps some of their ancestors in England would write a story reminiscing about their ancestors back in Germany, or back in Scandinavia or Iceland. And so that is more or less how we likely got Beowulf. And when you read into the abilities of these swords, they are stunningly ineffective, especially when you compare them to the super overpowered legendary weapons we've covered. Naegling, for example, breaks in two after a battle, during a battle, because even though the sword is said to be like bright, gleaming, sharp, strong, it was noted that Beowulf was just too powerful for the sword. He was just too manly and muscular, and when he used the sword, it just broke in two. Then there is the sword Hrunting, which Beowulf used to fight Grendel's mother at the bottom of a lake, no less. And the sword just didn't work too well, with it being noted that the fabulous power of that heirloom sword ended up failing when Beowulf went to use it, forcing Beowulf to just throw it away. And I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce this because it is Welsh, I believe. But Carnwanen was another Arthurian artifact, this time being the dagger that belonged to King Arthur. And it was a fantastic weapon, not necessarily for its offensive capabilities, but the wielder of this dagger was able to turn invisible, making it kind of an invisibility cloak, but instead of cloak, dagger. It is exclusively mentioned in the Welsh Arthurian legends, not the English or the French ones, and is the dagger with which Arthur kills the dreaded witch Ordu by just slicing her in half. So yeah, pretty cool weapon. Ruyi Jingubang is the magical staff wielded by the immortal Monkey King, Sun Wukong, which, yes, it's an actual thing of actual legends. For anyone who's played League of Legends, that horrible, toxic game. The legend behind Sun Wukong and his weapon are really quite interesting. Wukong, in the search for finding a weapon that was worthy of his ability and his capabilities and his strength, he goes to the underwater kingdom of Orguang, where there is a powerful dragon king that rules. And after testing out a bunch of different powerful legendary weapons, swords, spears, halberds, none of them really match up to his power. And so the Dragon Queen suggests that they give him this useless iron pillar that's just been stored, just been lying around in their treasury. And so Wukong goes down into the treasury. He finds this black iron pillar, and it's described as being 20 feet high, as being as thick as a barrel. And Wukong, I guess, just gets it, swings it around, and he thinks to himself, this would be a little more useful, a little more handy if it was like maybe a little thinner, a little shorter. And then this pillar starts to shrink down to the perfect size. And so as he's impressed with this, he kind of looks around the staff that he's made, or that has shrunk down to his perfect size, and he reads some inscriptions on the side of it, saying the compliant golden hooped rod. Or it said it in Chinese, but I can't pronounce the Chinese. And it also states the weight of this weapon as 13,500 catties, which, what the hell is a catty? Catty is a unit of weight primarily used in East Asia, roughly equivalent to 1 1/3 pounds or 600 grams. Some areas round to 600 grams, and others have more precise values like 604.78982 grams in Hong Kong. I think that's a little too precise for my liking. But the translated weight is around 8,000 kilograms, or 17,500 pounds. And if you remember from the other entry of the legendary Shah dynasty, Yu the Great apparently used this very same weapon to measure the depth of the ocean after the worldwide flood. So he got the staff, put it in the water, and then willed it to grow down to the bottom of the ocean, which is an interesting tying together of different legends. So a very cool piece of Chinese legend. And for those who haven't watched Dragon Ball Z, the main character Goku, or Son Goku, is actually based on the myth and legend of Sun Wukong, with Goku being kind of part monkey, or a particular monkey race, with him using the Nuai Bo staff, which is almost a direct translation of Ryu Bang, and him flying around on a cloud. Just some very cool similarities. The Mask of Tutankhamun is firstly an absolute thing of beauty. I mean, just look at the craftsmanship on this. It was made back in the day in ancient Egypt. It is solid gold with embedded rare gemstones. It's got lapis lazuli in there, great for enchanting, but also some obsidian, turquoise, glass, carnelian, and was made and used as a funerary mask, which was a mask used to put over the face of a pharaoh, or, you know, whoever, before they were buried in their tomb, and it was meant to accompany them in the afterlife. There is an inscription on this mask on the shoulders of the mask, and that inscription is a spell from the Book of the Dead, written there in Egyptian hieroglyphs. The mask itself was discovered in 1925, when British archaeologists discovered the tomb, or rediscovered it. They opened it up, and when doing this, they gazed upon Tutankhamun and his tomb and his mask for the first time in over 3,000 years. Which, just imagine how absolutely breathtaking that would be. And breathtaking is actually an interesting choice of words, because we all know about the curse of Tutankhamun, where it was said that it was inscribed in the tomb that whosoever shall open this tomb, or disturb the tomb, or disturb the sleep of the pharaoh, etc., whoever did this would be cursed to die and suffer horribly. And if you're interested in this, there is a whole long list of people who were either at the site, or they helped finance it, or they helped x-ray the tomb. They were just involved in some way with this, and it lists a bunch of their untimely deaths seemingly not too long after. Now, was this all down to a curse? Was this perhaps just a diseased sort of air, a little bacteria or a microbiome within the tomb that after being opened up was unleashed onto the people kind of nearby? Or is it all just a complete coincidence? I will leave that up for you to decide. But if you are ever in Egypt, in Cairo, it is on display in the Museum of Egyptian Artifacts, so absolutely go and check it out.
Darnwyn.
Dyrnwyn.
Dyrnwyn.
Dyrnwyn. First of all, sounds awesome. Dyrnwyn. But second of all is one of the 13 treasures of Britain, which is a list of ancient medieval Welsh treasures from mostly the 15th and 16th century. And Dyrnwyn is one of those treasures. We will cover the rest in full further down in the iceberg, as there are some mighty interesting ones. But this was, according to legend, a sword with a white hilt that, when drawn by the right worthy individual, would be engulfed in flames. The sword is in flames, not the person wielding it. That would be a pretty terrible ability. But this sword belonged to Rhywderch. I cannot pronounce this. It is Welsh. There's a lot of those funny pronunciations going on. But he was called this name, the Generous, and he was named such because he was very generous. So whenever anyone would ask him to borrow this sword, he would say, yeah, go on, here, take the sword. That is until people started figuring out that it went up in flames every time. So then eventually less and less people started asking him for it. But as I said, it is one of the 13 great treasures of Britain, and so we will have to cover the rest of them in the next video. And that is all we have time for. I honestly really love covering these sorts of icebergs. You know, even if the icebergs don't exist and I need to go and make my own lists, do my own research, make the different tiers, that's all part of the fun, and I guess just ensures that I have an actual unique iceberg list as a video on YouTube. If you enjoyed this video and you like these sorts of things, do hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, as I would hate for you to miss out the finale, the part 3 of this. Some of the entries in the bottom of the iceberg are just bonkers, just insane, and I wouldn't have believed they existed if I hadn't read about them. The next video shouldn't take too long, so expect to see that soon. Stay hydrated, look after yourselves and others, and as always, thanks for watching.